The laughter in the hall died suddenly when the mother of the bride entered, her dark skin catching the stairs like a spotlight. Someone at the back muttered, "She doesn't belong here." And before she could take another step, one of the groom's relatives brushed past her with a sharp shove that nearly knocked her off balance. Gasps rippled through the guests, but not one person came forward to steady her trembling frame. Follow if you want to know what happened next. She had spent the morning carefully preparing herself for this day, not because it was her wedding, but because it was her daughter's, a day meant to celebrate love, unity, and family. Her modest dress, chosen with care, had been pressed neatly, her hair pinned back in a style her daughter had always loved since childhood. Yet the mirror that morning had not been kind. She had caught herself hesitating, wondering if she would be judged, not for her attire or her smile, but for the color of her skin. Her daughter, radiant in her gown, had hugged her tightly before leaving for the ceremony, whispering, "You're the most beautiful part of my wedding. Mama, don't let anyone make you feel less." Those words should have carried her with strength through the day, but by the time she stepped into the venue, whispers had already begun to snake their way between tables. Some guests leaned in close to each other, their eyes narrowing as they whispered comments sharp enough to cut. Others didn't bother lowering their voices at all, letting remarks slip out as though she were invisible, or worse, as though she didn't deserve the dignity of being acknowledged. The groom's family, dressed in elegant fabrics, looked her up and down as though she were a blemish on their carefully painted picture of perfection. Still, she lifted her chin and walked forward, telling herself she was there for her daughter, not for their approval. Every step, however, felt heavier than the last. She thought back to the sacrifices she had made, the endless hours of work, the nights spent stitching clothes by hand, the days she went without so her daughter could have more. To be treated now as though her presence were a disgrace was a wound deeper than she had ever expected on what should have been one of the happiest days of her life. She took a seat quietly in the corner, folding her hands in her lap, trying not to let her shaking fingers reveal her unease. The bride hadn't yet seen any of this, and she prayed she never would. For all her daughter knew, this was a perfect day, and the mother, heart swelling with love and bruised with shame, decided she would endure in silence. But silence has a way of breaking, especially when truth is waiting, ready to tear apart every lie the world tries to uphold. The music in the church tried to patch over the fissures. The violin's high notes climbed and fell, but they could not lift the pressure that pressed on Margaret's chest. She sat rigid, palms folded, a practiced smile that had been rehearsed over years of public endurance. Around her, the congregation nodded along to the hymns, unaware or pretending to be that their courtesy was a paper-thin veil over something far crueler. Each whispered comment landed on her like a small stone. When the ceremony ended and the guests made their way to the reception hall, the coldness toward Margaret only deepened. At the entrance to the ballroom, the groom's uncle halted, then moved aside with exaggerated courtesy as if to indicate a boundary she had crossed. "Oh, we're so glad she could make it," he said loud enough for those nearby to hear, his smile baring teeth that never reached his eyes. The words were bland, the meaning was razor-sharp. Margaret kept her head bowed and walked past, but the motion left a bruise on her spirit. Seated at a table deliberately set at the far edge of the room, Margaret watched the celebration through a glass of lemon water that fogged each time she lifted it to her lips. She sensed eyes measuring and judging her clothes, her posture, the small tired lines at the corners of her mouth. When a server set down a plate before her, the food was lukewarm. When they came to refill her glass, there was a delay. These slights were small, almost laughably petty, but in their accumulation they became a language of exclusion, a map of where she did and did not belong. Conversations slithered around her like a snake. She overheard the groom's cousin, voice pitched to Carrie, tell a neighbor, "Well, some families come with a lot of history. We hope the children take after their father." Laughter chimed at the edges, brittle and rehearsed. The comment landed with the intended weight, a reminder that the color of someone's skin and the history attached to it could still be weighed and dismissed in polite company. That casual cruelty carved a hollow that no compliment could fill. Memories rose in Margaret's chest. The first time someone told her to fit in, a supervisor in a factory break room who said it as if it were a kindness, and the nights when she'd sewn dresses by hand so Sophia would have something to wear to school dances. Those memories were not only grief. They were the skeleton of her endurance. She had learned how to stand small when the world desired it, and how to gather strength quietly for the bigger fights. Now, though, the small indignities piled on top of one another until they felt like siege. Sophia moved through the reception with the practiced grace of a bride. She hugged aunts, laughed politely at jokes, and thanked people for the flowers. She had been raised by Margaret to speak with a soft power, words chosen to calm, to reassure. But beneath Sophia's smile, a different current ran, resentment for the people who would condescend to her mother, and cowardice for the souls who would not stand up. Her eyes kept flicking to Margaret, noting how guests avoided eye contact when the older woman passed, the way a child might shrink from stepping on a crack in the sidewalk. A staged toast worsened things. An uncle, fond of performing for effect, sprang to his feet with a premeditated grin. "To families who know their place," he intoned, then tipped his glass. The laughter that followed was too loud, sharpened on purpose. Margaret felt the room stream cold across her skin like a wind. People in that room, some of whom had once called her neighbor or colleague, let the civility thin until only the barb remained. A child, taught by adults who never bothered to correct them, asked aloud, "Why is she dark?" As if darkness were a curiosity in a museum rather than a person with a life. The question landed like a hand on Margaret's shoulder. Not a friendly pat, but a claim. "You are visible only as difference." Another guest, convinced of her own refinement, leaned over and made a show of rearranging a napkin as if to smooth out a wrinkle in decorum that Margaret's very presence had supposedly caused. At the buffet, a calculated slight took form. The groom's family received their plates steaming and handsome. Margaret's dish arrived lukewarm and unremarked. She mentioned it to a passing server who shrugged and muttered something about timing. The message was clear. Hospitality could be apportioned with a moral judgment. She pushed the cold plate away for a moment, then ate because she would not allow them the satisfaction of thinking they had starved her of dignity. Between the staged toasts and the tinkling laughter, rumor and gossip threaded through clusters of relatives. Questions about her past, did she ever marry? What happened to the father? Were framed as harmless curiosity but functioned like knives, cutting at reputations and assigning absence to blame. People spoke as if narrative could be authorized without asking. They drew conclusions that burdened a woman who had never asked for sympathy, only for the right to exist as her daughter's mother. Margaret thought of the evenings she had worked 3 jobs to keep a roof above their heads, of the nights she sat up stitching a prom dress by the light of a single lamp, and of the time she sold a ring that had been her mother's so Sophia could go to college. These were not anecdotes for pity. They were the ledger of a life spent making room for another. She had traded comfort for opportunity, humiliation for a chance at respect for her child. That currency felt particularly heavy in a room that didn't account for its value. Sophia watched all of this build like pressure behind glass. Anger rose in her as steadily as a tide. She wanted to lash out, to name each cruelty and expose it to the light. But she also feared amplifying shame in a public place where her mother had already been forced to swallow it. Love and strategy warred in her, one voice urging softness to diffuse, another demanding confrontation in the name of truth. When an older neighbor, one who had known Margaret when their children were small, murmured from across the room that Margaret had always been the steady one, the anchor, a few heads turned. For a moment, that small defense did something like repair the air. It reminded some guests of earlier days when people had been kinder or at least more blind to difference. But the defense did not erase the deliberate cruelties that had been laid down. The pattern of exclusion persisted in microaggressions and in the purposeful turning away from a hand extended in greeting. By the time music thinned into something softer and slower, the night felt heavy with what was unsaid. Margaret sat for a long while, fingers wrapped around the stem of her glass, watching couples sway and children run under the tables. She could have left. She had left before, walking away from scenes that bruised and did not deserve her energy. But tonight something anchored her to the seat. Duty, perhaps, or defiance, or the stubborn belief that her presence was, in and of itself, a lesson. The small moment that shifted everything arrived not with rhetoric, but with warmth. Sophia, mid-laugh and mid-hug, saw her mother across the room and broke free from the circulating niceties. She crossed the hall and slipped her hand into Margaret's. There was no speech, just a daughter standing before her mother with a look that delivered more than words could. It was the quiet act of acknowledgement that inoculated the scene against more of their cruelty, the human touch that began to rewrite how others might see Margaret. That acknowledgement was a spark. It did not erase the whispers or the rude toasts, but it made them less potent. The room, which had been leaning toward social cruelty, felt the first lean back toward truth. Inside Margaret, the built-up weight lightened fractionally. The shame did not vanish, but it found company in a pride that was now shared. The storm that had been gathering, born of slights and gossip and ancestral prejudice, now had a crack through which light could enter. And though the battle was far from over, the seed of resistance had been planted in a place where innocence and memory had once failed. The middle of the dance floor, under ordinary lights, where a daughter took her mother's hand and declared, without shouting, that her place was not up for debate. The air inside the reception hall felt smaller after the earlier humiliations, as if a lid had been placed on joy and the guests were all trying to pretend nothing had happened. Margaret sat with her back straight, hands folded in her lap, feeling the sting of every look as if it were a small hot coal pressed along her spine. She kept her face composed because she had practiced composure for decades, because the world often made room for her only when she swallowed hurt and walked on. But being made into a spectacle at her daughter's wedding had opened an ache she had kept carefully guarded. Tonight, the ache hummed under her skin like a low drumbeat, a warning that silence could no longer contain everything. Jasmine stood beneath the chandeliers, a figure of white and determination. For a long moment she watched the room as if cataloging names, faces, little reactions, the precise ways people had turned when Margaret passed. Then she inhaled and stepped forward. Her voice, when she spoke, startled some into attention. A bright, clean sound that cut through the polite clinking of glasses and the low murmur of conversation. "Before we go any further," Jasmine said, her voice steady, though a tremor ran through it, "I need to address something." Many in the room glanced around as if searching for the cause. An accident, a spilled drink, anything that would excuse a sudden halt to celebration. But Jasmine's eyes were fixed on her mother, and those who had watched Margaret earlier felt a pressure settle in the pit of their stomachs like a remembered guilt. "You all saw what happened," she continued. "You saw how my mother was treated, how people pointed, how some of you laughed, how others pretended not to notice." She let the words hang, and they landed like stones. "She is my mother. She raised me. She gave me everything, and I will not have her humiliated on my day." A hush rippled across the room. Conversations died mid-sentence. Plates sat forgotten. The groom's family shifted, their smiles stiffening as they realized this was not a private complaint, but a declaration in front of everyone. Margaret watched the way her daughter's mouth moved. She felt a fierce, almost unreal surge of pride that made her heart ache. Pride that bloomed hotter than the shame that had been thrown at her earlier. Jasmine stepped across the floor toward her, heels whispering on polished tile. When Jasmine reached her, she took Margaret's hand and raised it as if unveiling something precious. "This woman," Jasmine said, her voice ringing out with a clarity that surprised even her, "is the anchor of my life. If you cannot treat her with the dignity she deserves, then you have no place at this table." The room held its breath. A few hands began to clap, tentative, then steadier, as if people were testing whether kindness might spread by contagion. The sound swelled, uncertain, and then surging until it filled corners and crevices and made it harder for some to keep their faces neutral. But then a softer, unexpected voice rose from the back of the hall. "There is more you should know," the voice said, thin but resolute. Heads turned as an elderly woman paused, then pushed herself up from her chair and made her halting way toward the front. It was Mrs. Whitfield, Daniel's grandmother, whose silence had been conspicuous throughout the evening. Her cane scratched like a slow percussion against the floor as she approached. The room quieted with a new kind of attention. This was no longer simply a daughter's defense of her mother. It was becoming a reckoning. Mrs. Whitfield's pale eyes fixed on Margaret with an intensity that braided memory and accusation together. "I will not sit by," Mrs. Whitfield said, breath coming short but steady. "There are truths that must be spoken. Margaret saved my life once." A single tiny sound escaped somewhere in the back, half gasp, half incredulous laugh. Conversations which had only just halted now fractured into 1,000 swift murmurs. Margaret felt as if the floor dropped away for a moment. Saved her life? She had performed no heroic tales in public. If anything, she had become practiced at making herself small. But now someone she had never expected to defend her stood and spoke of a debt, an owed memory that cut across the very arrogance in the room. Mrs. Whitfield's voice grew steadier as she spoke, the tremor replaced by a clarity that seemed to surprise even her. "Years ago, I was attacked on a road at night on my way home from visiting a friend's bedside," she said. No one stopped. Cars passed without slowing. A shadow lunged at me, blows I can still feel, and there I was, sprawled, helpless. A woman came running from the darkness. She put herself between me and the man until others came. She dragged me to safety and stayed until the police arrived. That woman was Margaret. The hall listened as if stitched by the words. Faces turned, and in many, the blood drained as memory and the realization of cruelty collided. Margaret had not meant to keep such moments a secret, but there had been reasons: shame, a reluctance to draw attention, a belief that acts of kindness were private things not meant to settle accounts publicly. And yet here it was, a public accounting no one expected, a ledger of grace that unsettled the ledger of prejudice. Daniel moved forward, jaw slack. "Mrs. Whitfield, why didn't you tell us before?" "Why are you saying this now?" She looked at him with a tired patience. "Because it needs to be said when the wrong is being done in plain sight. Because tonight, while I sat here, I watched people reduce a life to a joke. You sat and listened. I will not be part of that." As Mrs. Whitfield spoke, small acts of recognition began to spread. A woman who had earlier smirked lowered her eyes and wiped at them with the back of her hand. A child tugged at a father's sleeve and pointed to Margaret, whispering that she had been brave. The groom's father, who had spoken earlier of lineage and appearances, swallowed and turned his face away. Not everyone softened. Some stiffened, tangled in the stubbornness of their habits, but the room's center of gravity had shifted. Margaret felt a tremor of something like relief. It was not the triumph of vengeance, but the quiet, seeping recognition that sometimes truth, when spoken by the right person at the right time, can rearrange the social tide. She drew breath and felt the eyes on her. For so long she had remained the audience for other people's narratives, never the author. Now, an authoring voice rose inside her, a measured steadiness that seemed to surprise even her. "I did what I had to do," Margaret said, her voice surprisingly clear. "I was there because someone needed me. I have no desire for praise. I didn't seek credit, but I will not be cast as a caricature for the comfort of others." Her words landed differently than the earlier jibes. They were not a defense so much as an assertion, a life lived with choices, sacrifices, danger, and quiet generosity. She spoke of long nights working 2 jobs, of pennies saved on a counter to buy not luxuries, but opportunities for a child. She did not list sufferings for sympathy. She described them as facts of a life stitched together by endurance and small acts of love. The crowd began to lean in, conversation hushed to a reverent murmur. People who had been ready to laugh now felt chastened. Some reached for hands to squeeze or to offer a hesitant apology. Others looked down at their glasses, the act of sipping suddenly the most civilized way to hide discomfort. The groom himself approached, his earlier hauteur replaced by an uncertain humility. "Margaret," he said, The sentence broke as he searched for a proper word, any word, that might bridge the rupture caused by his kin's ignorance. Outside the veneer of polite society, The women who had stood with their neat opinions found themselves confronting a narrative they had not considered. Memories began to surface as neighbors and old friends exchanged looks and whispered remembrances of Margaret tutoring children in the neighborhood, of her bringing a pot of soup to an elderly neighbor, of quiet loans repaid with a smile. Each anecdote acted like a tile, and together they began to form an image the guests had not allowed themselves to see. Then came the moment Margaret dreaded and expected in equal measure, the inevitable backlash from those who felt exposed. The groom's uncle, flushed with indignation and entitlement, rose and attempted to recenter the evening by making a joke that fell flat. "Well, perhaps we've had too many emotions for one night," he smirked. But his voice lacked the bite it had earlier. Applause that followed Jasmine's remarks drowned out his attempt. A younger cousin, flustered, muttered an apology and fled to the bar. By the time the band struck up a gentle tune, the atmosphere had irrevocably shifted. The evening's cruelty had been pierced by truth and defense, and while not all hearts had changed, the night's current had been redirected. Margaret sat a little taller, feeling the difference as if it were a physical thing beneath her ribs. She took in the sight of her daughter, sturdy, brave, radiant, and felt a fierce, tender pride that made her throat ache. At the table later, a small group lingered and spoke in calmer voices. Some offered apologies that were awkward but sincere. Others offered actions: an invitation to Sunday dinner, a hand extended to lead Margaret to the dance floor. The offer to dance was simple, yet it felt enormous, an acknowledgement that she belonged, if only finally, to the community that had once recoiled from her. Margaret declined the first invitation to dance, not because she did not want to celebrate, but because she needed a moment to let the night's events settle. She watched as Jasmine moved through the crowd, collecting hugs and apologies the way a gardener gathers stray blooms. In the quiet that followed the dinner, Mrs. Whitfield lingered by Margaret's chair and squeezed her hand. The old woman's eyes were wet. "You did not have to carry that alone," Mrs. Whitfield whispered. "Sometimes we forget what it costs to stand up for someone. Tonight, we remember." Margaret let herself accept the comfort, not as a prize but as a recognition that had been long overdue. The turning point of the evening was not a single declamatory speech or a dramatic scene of conflict. It was the collective smallness of many people recognizing they had been wrong, and the largeness of a daughter refusing to let that wrong go unchallenged. In that slow shift, dignity began to lace itself back into Margaret's posture. When at last Jasmine led her mother to the dance floor for a small, private turn beneath the chandeliers, the room gave a soft, spontaneous cheer. Margaret felt lighter, not because every slight had been erased, but because the story of the night had been rewritten in a way that highlighted courage, sacrifice, and truth. And though enemies of pride and prejudice would always be present on the peripheries of life, that night had altered the story for those inside the hall. It had shown in living color that the measure of a person could not be written by the shallow ink of assumption. Margaret, who for so long had made herself small, stood in the warming light and allowed herself to be seen. The hall, still buzzing from the confrontation, seemed to breathe in unison with Margaret. For a long moment after the outburst, silence had wrapped itself around the guests, heavy yet cleansing, as though every heart was recalibrating. Then, almost imperceptibly, the wedding began to move again. A violin picked up where it had faltered. Jasmine and Daniel stood together holding hands, and laughter, tentative at first, began to ripple back into the evening. The shame that had been hurled at Margaret had not vanished, but something deeper now shimmered through the room: respect. Margaret stood near the edge of the crowd, not retreating, not shrinking, but steady. Her chest rose and fell with a rhythm of quiet triumph. For years she had grown accustomed to invisibility, to being tolerated rather than embraced. But tonight the veil had been torn. No one could pretend they hadn't seen. No one could unhear the defense her daughter and new son-in-law had voiced so fiercely. She had been seen, and it was enough to change everything. Daniel approached her first, his voice gentle but unshaken. "Margaret," he said, his hand extended, "I owe you an apology, not for tonight alone, but for all the small silences I kept in the months leading to this day. I should have spoken sooner." Please forgive me." Her eyes softened. The boy who now stood as her son-in-law had flaws like every man, but in his words she heard sincerity. She clasped his hand. "You've spoken now," she said, her voice carrying the weight of endurance. "And that matters more than you know." Other relatives came in waves, some hesitantly, some with genuine shame. A cousin mumbled that she had been wrong to stay quiet. Another guest admitted with tears that she had once laughed at cruel jokes and now felt the sting of regret. Not all came forward. Prejudice is stubborn, often hidden in corners where pride clings. But Margaret didn't need them all. She needed only the visible proof that dignity could rise above cruelty. Jasmine wrapped her arms around her mother's shoulders and whispered, "You will never be alone again. Not in this family. Not in my life." The words undid a knot inside Margaret that had been tied for decades. For the first time in years, she felt the warmth of true belonging settle across her skin like a shawl. Later, when it was time for speeches, Daniel raised his glass. "Tonight," he said, his voice firm but bright, "is not just about a marriage between two people. It is about uniting families, uniting hearts, and recognizing the courage of those who came before us. Margaret is the reason Jasmine is the woman I fell in love with, resilient, compassionate, and unyielding. To her we owe gratitude. To her we owe respect." Applause broke like a wave. Margaret blinked against the sting in her eyes, her heart swelling as the crowd echoed affirmation. For once she wasn't a shadow in the back. She was at the center, honored, visible. As the music returned in full, Jasmine tugged Margaret onto the dance floor. Margaret resisted at first, embarrassed by the spotlight, but Jasmine insisted. Soon, laughter bubbled between them as they swayed, joined by Daniel, then by a few others. The circle widened, a tapestry of faces and colors, every step a quiet rebellion against the insult that had tried to define the night. And Margaret, in that swirl of music and movement, felt herself shed the last remnants of silence. She was no longer the woman merely enduring prejudice. She was the woman who had faced it and still stood with dignity intact. Her daughter's happiness was proof that the legacy of pain could transform into strength. As the evening drew to a close, Margaret stood once more at the edge of the hall, gazing at the lights strung like stars across the ceiling. Her thoughts drifted to the years behind her, the sacrifices, the loneliness, the countless times she had swallowed her pride to keep peace. And now, to this moment where peace was redefined not as silence, but as justice met with compassion. Prejudice humiliates, she thought, her lips curving into a faint smile. But dignity, once claimed, can never be taken. The lesson of the night was not hers alone, but everyone's. Every guest who had witnessed cruelty turned to courage would carry the memory forward. And perhaps, just perhaps, tomorrow would be gentler because of it. The music faded, but Margaret's spirit did not. She walked out of the hall with her head high, her heart steady, and her story reclaimed. What had begun as a night of humiliation ended as a night of triumph, a testament that love, courage, and dignity are stronger than shame.